Oh, there you are. Hi, welcome to the course of World History. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson. Let's get this thing going. Today we are looking at the differences between the Eastern and Western hemispheres to try to dig into the question of why the Eastern hemisphere developed so much faster than the Western hemisphere in terms of human civilization. So let's see. First of all, let's look at some of the differences. So Eastern Hemisphere civilizations all arose in river valleys around the same latitude. These included the Egyptians, over here, the Mesopotamians, right next door, the Indus River Valley civilizations, just across those mountains, and the Chinese, up over here, all kind of existing in the same band stretched across Asia into North Africa. Now, our Western civilizations, the first ones arose about 3,000 years later than those in the Eastern Hemisphere. So it wasn't until about 2,000 years ago that we have our first civilizations in the West. And these arise in mountainous areas, loaded with a lot of jungles, very different terrain. This first civilization, by the way, was the Olmec. They're the precursors of the Toltec and eventually the Maya, all in that Mesoamerica area. Now, there are important climate and terrain differences that help to explain some of the differences. Now, in both hemispheres, the first civilizations arose in warm climates. Okay, climates that didn't really have cold winters. China, they would see snow, but most of the other climates did not. In the East, these warm climates stretched over a much larger geographic area. So we have this continuity of climate and similar climate zones across most of the early civilizations. The terrain in the East also included a lot more grassland and river valleys. Okay, rivers for people to live in and grassland surrounding those rivers. Semi-arid areas tend to have, a lot of grass. And this would allow those civilizations to kind of spread out over those territories. Whereas in the West, we're dealing with a lot of mountain and jungle stuff that's really confining and can squeeze in a population. Now, the food advantages of the East are really important because grains are the most abundant food source on Earth, and most civilizations eat a fair amount of grains. And the East included a tremendous variety of grains: wheat, rye, millet, barley, rice, oats, all of these different grasses growing in all these different areas and eventually getting traded and mixed together contributed to the diet of the people of the East. They're reasonably easy to grow and cultivate, and so this leads to population increases and the need for, civil society, civilization. The West mostly relied on maize as their main grain. They did have other foods. They had potatoes and beans were also important to the diet, but they didn't have the diversity of grains that were available. So food would be a stretch to say that, they didn't have as much food. They definitely had the ability to have as much food, but it took more effort to cultivate the food needed for large populations. Another big important difference was the drier climate in the West. Let's flip back. These arid and semi-arid areas, it's really easy to store grains in arid and semi-arid climates. Not a lot of moisture gets in to create mold and fungus and destroy your crops. But in the West, you wound up having a lot of that jungle terrain where that humidity might seep into any stored food and ruin it. So the larger supplies of food meant that those populations could survive droughts or crop disease much more successfully than those in the Western Hemisphere. The animal advantage is huge. The East really had a much bigger variety of domesticatable animals. Horses, cows, sheep, pigs, goats, oxen, donkeys, camels, these are all Eastern Hemisphere animals. In fact, of all of the large domesticatable animals that are over 100 pounds when fully grown, all of them, except for llama and alpaca, are native to the Eastern Hemisphere. The West just doesn't have this range. And what they do have, the llama and alpaca, just don't compare in size and strength to their Eastern counterparts. Okay, yes, you can ride a llama, but could you imagine somebody trying to ride a llama into war against a knight on large horse, it's just not going to end well for the llama rider. But more important than warfare is really how animals are harnessed and put to work. Because in the East, these large oxen and whatnot can be hitched to plows. And those plows can do the work of multiple people in preparing the fields to get food in for your population. So these are huge advantages that the East had that the West really lacked. Another one is civilization contacts. Now, people are adaptable, right? We can adapt to cold, dry weather. People live far in the north where it's cold and dry. But they often get sick if they travel to a hot, humid climate, and vice versa. People don't like to change their climates dramatically. Now, this east-west axis of the Eastern Hemisphere meant that most travel would be east-west, and you wouldn't see dramatic changes in climate. Whereas in the Western Hemisphere, it's primarily a north-south axis. So travel would mean traveling far north or far south and crossing multiple climate zones and increasing your likelihood of illness, sickness, and people just don't want to be in these unfamiliar climates. So that made exploration and long distance travel much more common, much safer in the Eastern Hemisphere than in the Western Hemisphere. Now, with this travel comes trade, this contact with other civilizations. People in the East were meeting other societies all the time. And they have this exchange of ideas, this exchange of goods. We have talked about the Silk Road and all of those connections and exchanges of ideas and goods. And this meant systems of government, religions, innovations like writing and numeracy, they're all spreading much more quickly in the East as more civilizations are having contact with each other and stealing good ideas. People adopt these inventions. They find out what somebody else is doing, and then they figure out a way to make it even better. And then the original inventors see that improvement, and they improve upon that improvement. And you get this cycle of improvement based upon trade and contact with each other. And this is causing the Eastern Hemisphere to explode in technology. So the Eastern Hemisphere societies really have an abundance of advantages. The Native Americans just do not have nearly as many geographic or natural resource advantages as the East does. And that means that as the Europeans have adopted and improved all these advances from all these people across all these civilizations, making all those contacts, and adding that with the horse and the plow, and when they arrive on the Western Hemisphere, the civilizations in the Western Hemisphere just do not have a real opportunity to resist the Europeans when they seek dominance over them. The Europeans have come from a different world with different connections and a list of advantages that would overcome the greatest of Native American opposition. Not because of any cultural differences or difference in people. We don't want to get racist in here and say that the Europeans conquered because they are superior humans. No, it's because of all the advantages that the Eastern Hemisphere had presented them, made them more technologically advanced and therefore able to conquer. And that is why the Eastern Hemisphere, and Europe in particular, was able to conquer and colonize the Western Hemisphere with relative ease. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. Farewell.